My grandson helped me reinstall my banking app. A week later, my entire retirement fund, over $200,000, was gone. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to breathe through the silence. They thought I was too old to notice, too slow to fight back. But they forgot who I used to be, and they never expected what I would do next. I asked my grandson Brandon to help me reinstall the banking app on my phone. I had accidentally deleted it while trying to clear space for photos. Nothing serious, just one of those little tech mistakes people my age tend to make. He came over that Saturday afternoon, all smiles and confidence, phone in one hand, and his gaming headphones still hanging around his neck. He didn't even wait for me to explain much. Said something like he'd done this before for his dad. Quick, easy, no problem. I remember watching his fingers move fast across my screen while I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold before I noticed. I trusted him. Brandon's 15. Good kid, or so I thought. He still calls me Gran, not Grandma, like the others. And he's the only one in the family who comes around without being asked. That day he told me I looked tired and that my new slippers were cute. It was small, but I felt seen. There's something about moments like that. You hold on to them when you're older. You tell yourself maybe things aren't as distant as they seem. Later that evening, I dreamed about my late husband for the first time in years. He was standing by the fence in our old backyard, looking at me like he used to when I forgot to turn off the porch light. Not angry, just sad. I woke up before I could say anything to him. The next morning, I opened my banking app. Everything looked normal. The same blue and white logo, the usual layout. Brandon had even arranged the icons on my home screen to make it easier for me. I smiled and thought to myself how lucky I was to have a grandson like him. That feeling didn't last long. Looking back now, I realize how much I wanted to believe that someone in the family still cared without needing something in return. I didn't know then that by handing him my phone, I had also handed him the keys to my entire retirement savings. If you've ever been in a moment where everything felt fine on the outside, but something inside you stirred a quiet nudge, a flicker of unease, maybe you'll understand what came next. Because I didn't retire from life, and certainly not from paying attention. The sun hadn't fully come up when I noticed it. I was sitting at the dining table with my first cup of coffee, scrolling through the news on my tablet, like I do most mornings. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you don't notice until it's heavy enough to press down on your shoulders. I tapped the banking app. The screen loaded slower than usual, but I didn't think much of it. When it finally opened, I blinked twice. The balance read $3.92. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe it was the wrong account. I backed out, checked again. Still $3.92. I rubbed my eyes closed, the app reopened it. Same. I felt my pulse shift. That cold, tight sensations that starts at the back of your neck when your body realizes something before your brain can explain it. I didn't panic. Not yet. I had dealt with numbers my whole life. 38 years with the IRS had trained me not to jump to conclusions too quickly, but I also knew when something didn't smell right. I checked the transaction history. Instead of the familiar layout, there was nothing. No deposits, no withdrawals, just a blank screen. Then I noticed the menu bar was slightly different. The icons weren't where I remembered them. It was subtle, but off. That's when it hit me. The app wasn't real. I put my coffee down and stood slowly. Walked over to the drawer where I kept my old tax audit notes, tucked behind expired coupons and old birthday cards. I pulled out a notepad and wrote the current date and the balance. Then I wrote one word underneath investigate. I went back to my laptop, logged into my account through the official website. The screen didn't even ask for the same security questions. That confirmed it. Someone had tampered with my phone. It didn't take long to see the damage. Over $200,000 drained across 3 days, divided into smaller transfers, clean, spaced out. Classic layering. Whoever did this knew how to make money disappear without raising alarms. The names attached to the transfers weren't full names, just generic phrases, placeholder codes. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But I had seen that exact pattern years ago in a case involving a fake retirement account funnel. I had helped break that case wide open. The agent who ran point on that operation used to call me the ghost net because I could trace the invisible. And now here I was, sitting in my kitchen, watching my own life savings evaporate in front of me. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race, but something in me felt like it had gone very, very still. I looked around the room, the same room where I used to help Brandon with his middle school math, the same place where I'd made Graham's birthday cakes from scratch. I'd built a life in this house full of routines and quiet moments, and now quietly that life had been breached. I didn't tell anyone that day. I just sat with the weight of it. Not everything vanishes with a sound. Something vanish so quietly they echo. I spent the rest of that morning going through every corner of the app. The more I looked, the more wrong it felt. The colors were almost identical to the real bank's branding, but the text was slightly off. The transactions page that should have shown months of deposits and withdrawals was empty, as if nothing had ever happened in that account. I held my phone in one hand and my old tax audit notebook in the other. It wasn't just instinct anymore. It was clear. Someone had swapped the real banking app for a duplicate. It was custom-built, designed to sit quietly on my home screen and fool me into believing everything was still there. And it had worked. I had dealt with this kind of fraud before years ago, when someone built a mirror version of a corporate payroll system. That case had taken 6 months to unravel, and the culprit had been a finance student from New Jersey. He'd almost gotten away with it. Almost. I hadn't thought about that case in years, but now the details came rushing back like muscle memory. The mirrored structure, the redirected login data, the spoofed interface that looked close enough to pass for real, but never perfect. I took a closer look at the app's permissions. It had full access to my contact's camera, microphone, and messages. That should have set off every internal alarm I had, and yet it hadn't, because I had trusted the person who installed it. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. The app had been side-loaded not from the App Store, but installed manually, which meant Brandon didn't just download it. He had to approve security settings, go through developer mode, and mask the original. That wasn't accidental. That was intentional. But Brandon was only 15. I didn't want to believe he could think this up on his own. There had to be someone else involved, someone older, someone who knew exactly how to make an app look and feel like the real thing, but hollowed out on the inside. I thought of my son, Graham. He'd worked in mid-level operations for a financial planning firm before he switched to real estate. Always shifting, always trying something new. His wife, Siobhan, worked in digital media and had once mentioned knowing coders from her freelance days. The pieces started to align in uncomfortable ways. A week earlier, Siobhan had joked during Sunday lunch about how the world was moving too fast for retirees to keep up. She said it lightly between bites of salmon and quinoa, but something in her tone had made me tighten my grip on my fork. Graham had laughed, said something about how I'd be fine because I was sharper than most people half my age. Now that memory replayed with a sour aftertaste. I walked to my study and pulled out the printed statement from the last quarterly report. I compared it line by line to the numbers in the app. They didn't match, not even close. My balance had been stable until last week when the transfers began. Every transfer fell between midnight and 4 a.m. The timestamps were precise, like clockwork. I wrote the time blocks down and cross-checked them with my home Wi-Fi usage logs. Years ago, I had set up an automatic system to track which devices connected to the network overnight. At the time, I thought it was for safety. It turned out to be something else entirely. There it was. An unfamiliar device ID, logged into my network 4 nights in a row. Same window of time. The same nights the money was taken. I closed the notebook and sat very still. This wasn't a random theft. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone who knew me, someone who counted on my trust, someone who had already stepped into my home and taken something they believed I would never notice. But I had noticed, and I wasn't done. I didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, because my mind wouldn't stop turning. Every detail from the last month started rearranging itself in my head, like pieces in a puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling. The morning after I discovered the device logs, I drove out to the community library. It was the only place nearby with wired internet and no shared Wi-Fi. I logged into a clean system, opened a private browser window, and began searching for app developers using frameworks that could mirror a banking interface. I found 3 known templates that matched the structure I had seen on my phone. One of them was hosted through a cloud-based testing site. I traced that site's admin access through the DNS record. The address attached to it didn't show much, just a scrambled redirect. But the backup email attached to the recovery page was partially visible. It included part of my daughter-in-law's handle, a combination she used for her Etsy store back in the day. I sat back and stared at the screen. Cold, steady disbelief. Not rage, not even betrayal yet. Just the quiet realization that the person who hugged me every Sunday, who once asked for my cornbread recipe like it was a secret treasure, had a hand in draining my future one quiet transfer at a time. I went home and didn't say a word to anyone. I made dinner like I always did. Roast chicken, potatoes, steamed green beans, just like any other Sunday meal. Graham and Siobhan arrived late with Brandon trailing behind them, glued to his phone. Brandon looked up and gave me a lazy smile. I kept my face soft. I didn't ask where they had been. I didn't ask why they hadn't returned my call 2 days ago. I didn't mention the missing money or the app. I watched. Graham opened a bottle of wine without asking. He had stopped asking about things in my house for a while now. He spoke about his new property deal, how he was closing on a fixer-upper across town. He said it with confidence, a tone I used to find impressive. Now it felt like cheap cologne. Siobhan chimed in with some news about a friend starting a business in mobile finance. She looked at Brandon when she said it. Just briefly. A glance. Not long enough to register for anyone else. I didn't eat much. I just nodded at the right moments, kept my tone pleasant. That's how you survive in rooms full of liars. You make them believe they're winning. When they left, Brandon lingered in the hallway. He said he'd help me move photos off my phone next week if I needed. I nodded. He walked out whistling. That night I opened a new notebook. Not the audit one, a clean one. I wrote down every detail I remembered from dinner, every phrase, every movement, especially the glance. I dated it and placed it inside the folder with the device logs and the app metadata. I needed more than instinct. I needed evidence, real timelines, IP logs, transfer patterns. I had them, but I needed something else now. A pattern of behavior, a motive, a connection that wouldn't just expose what they did, but why they thought they could get away with it. The next day, I drove 2 hours to a retired colleague's home. Marion Fields. She used to handle high-risk audit profiles with me. She had left the IRS to run private financial security cases for elder fraud victims. She greeted me at the door like no time had passed at all. I laid out the basics. No names, no accusations, just the framework. She didn't speak for a full minute. Then she opened her laptop and told me exactly what to do next. I didn't know it yet, But the next 2 weeks would reveal far more than I was ready for. What had started as a single breach would unfold into something deeper. A structure built not just to steal, but to erase me entirely. Quietly, legally, permanently. And I had just begun to dig. The drive back from Marian's house was long and silent. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my thoughts moved faster than the road. I replayed every step she had walked me through. The forensic tools, the data pull, the suggestion to start documenting behavior patterns in parallel with the financial trail. Marian had always been methodical, and she still was. She didn't tell me what to feel. She gave me a roadmap. The next day, I took her advice and began capturing screenshots from my online banking account, the legitimate one, through the bank's website, not the app. I printed the records and began building a paper timeline. Each page had handwritten notes, small details I didn't want to forget, like the fact that all major transfers occurred just after 2:14 a.m., or that one of the receiving accounts was routed through a fintech service I didn't recognize. I also started logging small behaviors at home, the way Brandon suddenly stopped asking me about school or chess like he used to, the way Siobhan began bringing store-bought meals instead of asking me for recipes, the way Graham's voice tightened whenever I mentioned taxes or retirement. A pattern was forming, and it wasn't just financial. It was personal, strategic. They weren't just stealing from me. They were rewriting my place in their lives, shifting the power, making me unnecessary. On Thursday, I made an appointment at the bank. Not the branch near my house, but the larger one where I still knew a few names. I asked to speak with someone in fraud detection. The woman who took my case was younger than Brandon, but she listened closely. I gave her printed logs, screenshots, and a thumb drive Marian had helped me prepare. I didn't name anyone, not yet, but she promised to escalate it. When I got home, I saw Graham's car parked outside. He was sitting in the driver's seat, engine off, phone in hand. He looked up when I pulled in. I waved. He didn't. Inside, he said he had stopped by to check on the thermostat. Said Brandon had mentioned I was having trouble with the heat. The house was warm. No issue. Still, he walked straight to the hallway and opened the control panel like it was his own. I watched his movements carefully. He didn't ask to touch anything, didn't explain why he was there. He just acted like he belonged. That night, I changed the locks. On Saturday, Siobhan called. She said she had a surprise for me and asked if I was free next Friday evening. Something about a new restaurant that had opened and how it would be good for the whole family to reconnect. Her voice was bright, too bright, like someone rehearsing lines they didn't believe. I told her I'd think about it. The next day, I went back to Marian's. We reviewed the new documents and ran a trace on the fintech service. One of the accounts used a proxy server, but the recovery email had a prefix tied to a prepaid phone. Marian smiled when she saw it. She had cracked a case like this before. We made a list of everything still missing. Then we built a timeline from the first unauthorized login to the last transfer. The evidence was there. Not just of theft, but of coordination. 3 people. Same household. Same Wi-Fi network. Same timeline. I was no longer just suspicious. I had proof. Quiet, damning proof. The kind that doesn't just accuse, the kind that convicts. I waited until Monday before calling the federal tip line. I spoke slowly, clearly, sticking to the facts. The agent on the other end didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she asked if I had supporting documentation. I told her I did. Printed, organized, verified by a retired federal auditor. She gave me a case number and said I'd be contacted by a cybercrimes investigator within 72 hours. The following day, I received an encrypted email from someone named Agent Doherty. He requested a secure upload of all documents. I followed his instructions, careful with every step. No shortcuts, no assumptions. I double-checked every file before sending. Then I waited. For 3 days, I lived as if nothing had changed. I folded laundry, watered the front porch plants, called a neighbor to ask about a plumbing recommendation. I made eye contact with Brandon when he swung by for cereal. I answered Siobhan's texts with short, polite replies. I smiled when Graham mentioned refinancing the lake cabin again, though my name was still on that deed. But something had shifted. They didn't know what, but they sensed it. Brandon seemed quieter. Siobhan more careful with her words. Graham watched me longer when he thought I wasn't looking. On the fourth morning, Agent Doherty called. He asked a few simple questions, then thanked me. He said the information I had provided would be enough to begin an internal investigation. He advised me not to confront anyone directly, to avoid alerting the subjects prematurely. I assured him I had no intention of doing so. That evening I sat alone in the living room, lights dim, a notebook open on my lap. I wasn't writing anymore, just rereading, rechecking, making sure I hadn't let emotion distort the facts. I had spent my whole life believing that love, when real, was the strongest currency. But what I had now wasn't love. It was quiet manipulation, strategic dependency, and they had all played a role in designing it. I reviewed the list Marion had helped me build. Financial breach, app deception, unauthorized access, intent to defraud, all traceable, all falling under federal jurisdiction. The next step wasn't mine anymore. 2 days later, I received a confirmation email. The cybercrime unit had officially accepted the case for further action. I was to refrain from disclosing anything to my family. I agreed. That night, I changed my phone passcode and removed Brandon's Face ID. I cancelled 3 recurring payments linked to the joint grocery card Siobhan had set up in my name. I closed the old shared streaming account Graham still used. One by one, I began cutting the invisible threads they had tied to me. Not out of revenge, out of restoration. Because what they had taken wasn't just money. It was my right to feel safe in my own home, to trust the silence in my kitchen, to sit with my thoughts and know they hadn't been filtered through someone else's plan. And now, for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not out of comfort, but out of clarity. On a cool Thursday morning, the doorbell rang just after 9. I opened it to find a man in a grey suit, holding a leather briefcase and wearing a badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Agent Doherty. His presence was calm, deliberate. He asked if we could speak inside. I led him to the dining table. He didn't sit until I did. From his briefcase, he pulled out a folder thicker than I expected. Inside were the documents I had submitted, now marked and tabbed. He also had 3 printed reports, detailed logs of device access, financial transfers, and metadata from the fake banking app. He laid them out carefully. He spoke clearly, like someone used to giving people hard truths in digestible pieces. He confirmed what I already knew. The app on my phone had been custom developed to mimic my bank's real interface. It was loaded onto my phone manually, bypassing the App Store's security checks. The program had a back-end dashboard, hosted anonymously, allowing someone to monitor my balance in real time and schedule withdrawals in small, calculated bursts. He then showed me the origin of those withdrawals. 2 primary recipients. One was a shell account tied to a fintech platform. The other was a secondary transfer account, created under a false name, but linked to a known IP address that belonged to Graham's home office router. I didn't say anything. He flipped to the next page. The secondary account had then rerouted funds into a prepaid investment fund using credentials from a third-party app. That account had only one point of access: Brandon's school-issued tablet. Then came the photos. Captured security stills from the public library's Wi-Fi network logs, where Siobhan had uploaded encrypted documents using her personal login credentials. One of those documents included code for the app's interface, written under an alias later matched to her Etsy store credentials. The case was no longer circumstantial. I asked what would happen next. Agent Doherty told me the agency would be requesting a warrant to freeze the remaining assets in the fake accounts and begin a forensic audit of the associated devices. Due to Brandon's age, the juvenile division would handle his portion, but Graham and Siobhan would likely face adult charges, including wire fraud, identity deception, and elder financial abuse. He asked if I was prepared for what came after. I didn't answer. Before he left, he handed me a thin envelope. Inside was a letter confirming that the FBI had placed a temporary hold on all relevant accounts and that a federal investigation was now active. He told me someone from the local sheriff's department might also reach out in the coming week. When the door closed behind him, I sat still for several minutes. I watched the wind move the curtains. I listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator. And then slowly I folded the letter and placed it in the middle drawer of my writing desk. Not out of relief, not out of satisfaction, just because it was time. Later that afternoon, Brandon stopped by unannounced. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in the pockets of his hoodie. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a kid who had memorized a script someone else had written. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I told him I was tired. He nodded, eyes darting to the side like he had forgotten how to meet mine. He left without another word. That evening I added one last note to my timeline log. Then I closed the notebook and tucked it beneath the folder of evidence. There would be no more data to collect. Everything I needed had already surfaced, and the consequences were no longer mine to deliver. The next week moved slowly as if time itself was weighing the consequences. Each day felt like it was holding its breath. I received the first official letter from the district attorney's office on Tuesday. It outlined the freeze orders on the fraudulent accounts and stated that the case had been accepted into the Elder Abuse Protection Division. I read every word twice, then filed it alongside the others. By Wednesday, my phone stopped ringing. No texts from Siobhan, no casual check-ins from Graham, not even a reaction from Brandon on the family group chat. Just silence. Thick and pointed. On Friday afternoon, I drove into town, not for groceries or errands. I went to my bank branch to finalize the security protocols Marion had suggested. We added a two-step verification system, changed all linked contacts, and disconnected any third-party integrations. I also closed 2 of my smaller savings accounts that had quietly been accessed over the last year. One had been drained almost entirely. The other had a single transaction pending never cleared. I signed the papers and walked out lighter. When I returned home, I found an envelope taped to my front door. No return address. Just my name in rushed handwriting. Inside was a note. 10 lines from Graham. He didn't deny anything. He said he had made a mistake, that he never intended for things to spiral. He said the pressure of finances, Brandon's tuition and some poor investment decisions had pushed them too far. That they never thought I would notice, at least not until they had fixed it. The final line read, "You were always the smart one, Mum. I never stood a chance." I folded the note and placed it in a drawer I hadn't used in years. The kind of drawer where you keep things that don't belong in the trash, but don't deserve the dignity of being framed. That night I sat in the backyard with a cup of tea and watched the porch light flicker. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt like someone who had finally stood still after outrunning a storm. On Sunday, the sheriff's department called. They requested a brief meeting for a final statement before moving forward with the formal proceedings. I agreed. When they arrived the next morning, I led them to the kitchen. They reviewed the report from the FBI, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then had me sign 3 documents. As they were leaving, one of the deputies paused at the door. He looked at me with a strange mix of respect and sadness and said, "Most people don't fight back like this." I didn't respond, because it hadn't felt like fighting. It felt like surviving. Later that afternoon, I called Marion and thanked her, not just for the technical support, but for reminding me that clarity isn't cruelty, that protecting yourself doesn't make you unkind, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop someone before they cross a line they can't return from. That evening, I looked at the empty calendar on my fridge. The family dinner that had been scribbled in purple marker 2 weeks ago was still there. I erased it with a single swipe. I made myself a quiet dinner and sat at the table alone. And for the first time in months, I didn't look over my shoulder. I didn't wait for a knock. I didn't rehearse what I would say if someone apologized. I just breathed. Because sometimes, silence is the only sound that feels like home. 2 weeks after the sheriff's visit, I received a formal notice from the county clerk's office. The hearing date was set. Not a trial, not yet. Just a preliminary session to determine how the financial recovery would be processed and whether any mediation would be offered to the family involved. I read it twice, then set it down next to my tea without emotion. That same morning, I also received an email from Brandon's school counselor. She had been listed as my emergency contact after Graham and Siobhan's phone numbers were removed. She mentioned that Brandon had stopped attending classes regularly and was currently under review by the juvenile division. She asked if I wanted to schedule a conversation. I didn't reply. That evening, I sat down and wrote a letter, not to the court, not to Brandon, but to myself. I needed to understand where I had let myself become small in their presence, where I had chosen to ignore instinct for the sake of family harmony. I wrote plainly, line by line. I acknowledged the hurt. I forgave myself for not seeing it sooner. And then I wrote the next part. I decided I would no longer leave things to be discovered after I was gone. That night I began rewriting my living trust. It took 2 full days. I reviewed everything, every clause, every name, every outdated assumption. I removed Graham and Siobhan as trustees. I removed Brandon entirely. I added a local women's scholarship fund I had once donated to years ago. I added the town's aging support centre. And I named Marion as my emergency financial executor. I drove the papers to my attorney in person. She read through them slowly, then looked up with a quiet nod. She said it was clear, strong, and unchallengeable. She filed the documents that same afternoon. From that moment on, I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was shaping what would happen next. The following week, I invited 3 women from my community book circle to lunch. Not to talk about what I'd been through, but to begin something new. A small initiative to help seniors learn basic financial tech literacy. Marion agreed to design a basic workshop. I offered to host it monthly in the church rec room. Something shifted that day. Not dramatic, not loud, just the slow return of forward motion. One afternoon, I walked into the small bedroom I hadn't used in years. It used to be Brandon's weekend room. The shelves were still full of board games, science kits, and dusty baseball caps. I took a box from the closet and began packing. Carefully, quietly. No anger in my hands, just clarity. I left the door open after I finished. I wanted to see the empty space, the cleared floor. I wanted to make room for something that hadn't happened yet. That evening, I baked a small apple tart and brought it to Marion's. We didn't talk much. We sat on her porch, watched the light fade, and let the air settle. As I drove home under the early spring sky, I didn't check the rearview mirror as often. There was nothing behind me I hadn't already faced, and everything ahead was finally mine to shape. The morning of the hearing arrived with a grey sky and quiet streets. I parked across from the courthouse and sat in my car for a moment, watching a woman with a cane walk up the steps ahead of me. She moved slow but steady. I waited until she had cleared the doors before stepping out. Inside, everything was sterile. White walls, brown benches, a faint smell of burnt coffee from the machine in the hallway. I checked in with the clerk, handed over my ID, and took a seat on the wooden bench outside courtroom 3. My name wasn't called until nearly an hour later. When I entered, I didn't look toward the other side of the room. I didn't need to. I already knew who would be sitting there. I focused on the judge, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a calm voice. The court reporter clicked away on her small machine. 2 attorneys stood off to the side. Neither were mine. This wasn't that kind of hearing. The judge reviewed the case summary aloud. She referenced the digital evidence submitted by federal cybercrime, the financial assessments from the bank, and the statements taken by the sheriff. Everything was confirmed. No objections, no denials. Then came the part I hadn't expected. The judge paused, looked up at me, and asked if I had a statement I wished to give regarding the recovery plan. I stood slowly, legs steady but heavy. I didn't speak long. I said I had no interest in recovering every dollar. That money was never what made me feel secure. What mattered was knowing I had not imagined it, that the theft had happened, that someone believed me, that something had been done about it. I told the court I wished for the remaining funds to be divided between the Women's Scholarship Foundation and the senior tech initiative we were building in town. I asked that no restitution be required from Brandon on the grounds that his participation had been guided by adults he should have trusted. Then I sat down. Graham's lawyer asked for a brief recess. It was granted. I didn't leave the room. When the judge returned, she ruled in favor of the recovery plan and signed the asset distribution into order. She stated the criminal process would now move into its next phase, and that civil actions, if any, would be considered separately. The hearing adjourned. I collected my papers, and left the building without looking back. Outside, the air smelled like rain. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just walked. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of envelopes and a cup of mint tea. I wrote 4 letters, one to the foundation, one to the tech center, one to Marion with a small check inside, and one to myself. That last letter I dated and sealed. It said, "You didn't forget who you were. You simply remembered too late. But now you know, and you won't forget again." I tucked it in the back of my recipe drawer between the old family cake cards and my mother's pecan pie instructions. I didn't need anyone else to read it. It was never meant for them. 3 weeks passed after the hearing. The house stayed quiet, the mailbox filled only with bills, newsletters, and the occasional postcard from a friend who still traveled. I made no announcements, no phone calls. I let the stillness wrap around me like a familiar sweater. Each morning I folded laundry, I watered the plants, I restocked the pantry one item at a time. Then one Thursday afternoon, just as the sun dipped low behind the roofline, I heard a knock. It wasn't rushed, just a single knock, then a pause. I opened the door and found Brandon standing there. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but like something in him had collapsed. He held his backpack with both hands. His eyes lowered. He asked if he could sit on the porch. I didn't answer right away. I stepped aside and he followed me to the bench near the rosebush. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching the neighborhood kids toss a frisbee across the street. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin. He said he had been suspended from school for a week, that his phone had been confiscated, that the counselor had told him he needed to write a reflection essay about responsibility and digital awareness. He said he didn't know what to write. I waited. He turned to me slowly and said he was sorry. Not loud, not theatrical, just that. He said he didn't know everything his parents were doing, that he had seen parts of it, but didn't understand it was wrong until it was too late, that he didn't know how to fix what was broken between us. I looked at him for the first time. There was no rage in me, no triumph, just a quiet ache. I told him that trust doesn't come back in one afternoon, that it takes longer to repair than it does to break, that I wasn't angry anymore, but I was still hurt, that I didn't know when or if it would fully fade. He nodded. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a notebook. On the front was a sticker I'd given him years ago when he was still in elementary school. A bright yellow sun with a face drawn on it. Inside were pages filled with scribbles, thoughts, half-sentences, and printed articles about digital scams. He had been trying to understand. He handed it to me and said he wanted me to have it. I didn't say anything. I took it gently and set it on the armrest. We sat for another 10 minutes. Then he stood and walked back toward the driveway. He didn't ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not a second chance. And that more than anything told me he had begun to change. After he left, I went inside and made tea. I sat by the window with his notebook and began reading. Each page was messy, unsure, but honest. Some wounds don't close with apology, but some beginnings don't need grand declarations either. Just the quiet willingness to face what was broken, and to not look away. Spring turned warmer that year, earlier than usual. The tulips I had forgotten to tend still managed to bloom along the garden edge. Life had a way of continuing even in the spaces I had once abandoned. I began waking earlier, walking farther, laughing softer but more often. The tech literacy workshop took off faster than any of us had expected. By mid-May, we had a waiting list. Women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s came with notepads and questions scribbled on receipts. Some were widows. Some had grown children who had stopped calling. Some just wanted to feel less afraid of screens and passwords. We didn't only teach them about apps or scams. We gave them language. We gave them agency. Marion and I started meeting every Thursday morning over coffee to plan the next session. Some days we didn't plan at all. We just sat together, letting the quiet feel whole. Graham never reached out. Siobhan sent a short letter once. She didn't say much. Just that they were moving to another state for work. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just distance. I didn't reply. Brandon sent another notebook in the mail. He didn't include a note. Just pages of his own thoughts written in larger, steadier handwriting. I read every word. The locks on my doors had changed. The accounts were clean. The house had fewer photos now, not out of spite, out of acceptance. One evening, I pulled out the recipe for my husband's favorite lemon pie. I hadn't made it in years. I baked it carefully, then sliced it into pieces and took half to the neighbors. The rest I ate slowly alone at the kitchen table. Not in mourning, in peace. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about losing family. It was about remembering myself and realizing that even after trust has been broken, a woman like me can still rebuild a life on her own terms, with steady hands and an open heart. If you've ever had to choose peace over people, I hope this story reminded you that it's not weakness, it's wisdom. Thank you for listening today. If a part of this story touched something in you, stay a little longer. You're not alone here. This space was made for women like us.